Help me welcome Bruce Hatcher. He began abusing drugs at a very young age, eventually becoming a hardcore drug addict by the time of 19 years old. His desire to break free took him through rehab, prison, and finally to the cross, where he found hope and new life in Christ. He now dedicates his life to preaching the gospel and sharing the lessons that he learned with others dealing with various life struggles. Welcome, Bruce. So glad you're here.
Hey, thank you, Stephanie, for having me today.
Well, we'd love to hear more about this story and all that God has done in your life. So please share.
All right. I do always like to remind people that there is hope. I was at a place in my life at one time where I just could not imagine how my life could ever rebound to having any significance whatsoever. And little did I know at that time, I was just in a valley of despair. And when you're in the valley, you can't really see what's on the other side of the ridge. And little did I know, right on the other side of that ridge was all the greatest moments of my life. And at one point, I was ready to end it. And I would have missed all the greatest moments of my life. And statistically, a lot of people who's been through what I've been through do not make it. And so my hope is that something about my story will help people. I'll tell you why I think I was able to be successful. And maybe you can listen to my story and you can hone in on something else that might help you. And so that will make those years that I felt for a long time were wasted. Maybe they have a benefit after all if you can use them. You might say that I was a little bit of a troubled youth. When I was 4 years old, my parents got a divorce, and over the next 10 years, both of them were married 3 times. And so by 14, this had all happened. It just seemed like there was always new people coming into my life, siblings, new mothers, new daddies, always coming in and out of my life. And I felt like I was sidelined when my parents would get a new love. All their attention would suddenly go to them. I was always the new kid in school. I got picked on a lot, had trouble making friends, got bullied, I never quite accepted. And then as far as church, my mother wasn't very religious at all, but my father, he would take me to church from time to time, but our attendance was still sporadic, and we moved from one congregation to another. So I never really felt connected anywhere there either. And it wasn't really until my teenage years that that kind of started to change, and I found a group of guys at school that made me feel like I belonged. We had a common interest of hard rock and heavy metal music. And these guys, they had the long hair. That was back in the big hair band days. And these guys had long hair and wore heavy metal shirts, had the same bands that I liked. And so we started hanging out. We started watching MTV together and watching these documentaries of our favorite bands, Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses. And those documentaries would really glamorize the rock and roll lifestyle. And that was impressionable on our young minds that we watched that and we saw the girls and we saw the drugs, and it seemed like there was no repercussions for any of that stuff. And we were like, that's the life I want. Fun, parties, friends, girls, why not? And so we started a band, and we were gonna be rock and roll musicians. Problem was we weren't really disciplined with our music careers, and so what we really excelled in was we kind of just went straight to the partying. That was our motivation anyway. And so it didn't take long at all. We were drinking beer and smoking pot every day. This is when we were still in junior high. We were doing this every day. And then we started going to parties and meeting older people at these parties, and that could get us harder stuff. And so we moved pretty quickly to pharmaceutical drugs, and then to LSD and cocaine, methamphetamine, ecstasy, and heroin. We did anything we could get our hands on. We smoked it, we snorted it, and eventually even got to the point where we were injecting it intravenously, even though we swore we would never do that. You never know how far sin will take you. Once you enter in that kind of thing, the brakes are out and you just don't know. But by the time I was 19, I was a hardcore druggie with a serious narcotic addiction, and crack cocaine was my drug of choice. I mean, I'd tried all these things, but almost immediately after I smoked crack cocaine, I just wanted it all the time. I couldn't have any money. Any money that I would get, I couldn't think of anything I'd rather spend it on. It didn't matter what kind of new gadget, video game, whatever. It didn't, there was nothing that I could imagine I wanted to spend it on more than another fix. Anything of value that I could get by hook or crook, I would trade it for more drugs. Somehow I was able to maintain a job through all that, but every payday, it would be the same routine. I would tell myself all day, I'm not going to use today. I'm not going to use. But then at lunch, there was a gas station down the road that would cash our checks for a small fee. And so I'd get the cash. It would be in my wallet for the second half of my workday. I'm not going to use. I'm not going to use. And then when I got off, it was like the car had a mind of its own. There was a four-way stop, and I always said, I'm not going to turn. I'm not going to turn. And when I'd get to that four-way stop, I would always turn. I remember one time I made it through that four-way stop, and I just went down the road and turned around and came back. And so it just seemed like it was a physical impossibility to keep from going to the drug house. And I would stay there. I got paid on Thursdays. I would stay there all night through the morning until it was time for me to go in Friday afternoon. I would go from the drug house in the same clothes, having not had anything to eat, nothing but just smoking crack all night. I'd go straight to work, and then I would crash while I was working, and it was miserable. This went on for years. And to this moment, the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life is the crash after a long binge. We would sometimes go on several day binges of using, and the crash after that, your mind is racing. You're out of money. There's no more resources. It's time to get some sleep. Your mind is racing, but you can't sleep. You're speeding. It takes a few hours. And so I'd lay there under an electric blanket, shivering, trying to go to sleep, and the light is coming through the windows, and my mind is just racing, and all I could think about was all the bad things that I've done, the fact that I'm out of money, all the bills that I have to pay now, and how am I gonna come up with the money to pay these bills? What do my loved ones and coworkers and everybody think about me being broke all the time? And then the failed attempts that I had made to stop, and how just utterly hopeless my situation was. I could not imagine how I could ever get out of this prison. And I believe I was in a deep state of depression for a long time. And this went on for years, and eventually one morning, crashing from a binge, I was just ready for it to be over. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I was at my grandmother's house, and she had a pistol that she kept for personal protection. And I took her pistol and I put it to my head, and I just wanted it to be over. I believe I would have pulled the trigger if it wasn't for just one thing. One thing stopped me, and that was the fear of hell. During those times that my dad took me to church services, I remember there was this one preacher that preached a sermon about hell, and I remember him saying, there is nothing in this life you could ever imagine that'd be worse than hell. He said, if hell is breakfast with Mussolini, lunch with Hitler, and supper with Stalin, that's all the hell I would want. And he said, and that doesn't even compare to what hell would be like. And so I thought, if this is true, if I pull this trigger, I'm not going to be in a better position. I'm going to be in a worse position. And so I didn't pull the trigger. I continued on, and I don't know how much longer, maybe a few weeks after that, maybe a few months. I don't remember, but sometime later, my dad showed up at my grandmother's where I was staying at the time. And he said, the family has had a meeting. We've talked about your condition. We all know you're using, and we can't continue to watch you do this to yourself. And I'm sure they were also a little concerned about the influence I might have on my sisters. And they said, so we don't want you to come around anymore. Don't come on Christmas. Don't come on Thanksgiving. Don't come on birthdays. Don't come at all until you decide to get some professional help. And so that really hit me hard. I never really calculated that would happen, even though I didn't really go, at that point in time, I did not go see my parents very often because I knew they didn't approve of my lifestyle. But it still hurt when I realized that now they're telling me don't come anymore. And so 2 weeks later, I decided to put myself in rehab. I called my dad and said, will you take me? And he did. He took me to the rehab. And so that was the start. When I got to rehabilitation, that's where the transformation really started in my life. I mean, that overcoming that hurdle of just admitting I had a problem to the world and stepping into a professional treatment, that was a hard step. But once I took that, the transformation really started there, even though it took a long time for it to bear fruit in my life. I got clean long enough in rehab that I started thinking clearly again. People don't realize that when you're using drugs, the part of your brain that you make decisions on is not working properly. And so people say, well, why do they do that? It's because the brain's not working right. And it takes a
Right.
while for your brain to start working right again. And after it did, I learned about the effects of drugs on the brain. It helped me to understand some of the cravings I was going through, and they taught us some tactics to kind of help with that. Also, the group sharing really helped because listening to other people who had similar experiences, it really got my mind to thinking about the possibility of change. It helped me build a little bit of confidence and a little hope and gave me a brief taste of what life could be like without addiction. But unfortunately, I broke one of the rules they taught us. They taught us change playgrounds and playmates. And so when I got out of rehab, I wanted to stay there, honestly, but my insurance ran out. And so I had to leave.
Mhm.
And I didn't have but that one group of friends. And so I didn't know. And so I convinced myself that I could still hang around those guys and just drink beer and smoke cigarettes, and I just wouldn't do drugs. Well, that was destined to fail, obviously.
Mhm.
Looking back, I gave a pretty admirable effort. I made it about a month hanging out with people who were doing drugs that I was addicted to and I didn't use for about a month. That was because of the head start I got from getting clean. But eventually I got back into it. And so that took me into several more years of drug use, and my drug habit just progressed. It got worse and worse until finally one night I was picked up in front of a drug house by the police.
Mhm.
Ended up spending about 3 months in prison. So that was the next really, I think, important stage in my recovery. Well, I spent about 3 months in the prison there, and that's where, again, I cleaned up enough that I could start to think clearly again. And I started thinking about reflecting on those experiences in rehab, thinking about what got me to this place and what my family must think of me now.
Mhm.
Where's my life headed? And as I thought on all those things, I kind of started paying attention to some of the things I was seeing in the prison because I'd been miserable as a drug addict for a long time. And so I wanted to quit. I just couldn't seem to get away from it. So I started noticing things. Three particular situations stood out to me. One, there was this young man who he was what you call a repeat offender. All the inmates knew him really well, and even the guards knew him well. And he got out a few days after I was there, and about 2 days later, he was back in there on on a new charge.
Wow.
I thought, what is
Mhm.
wrong with this guy? He cannot even be free. I mean, he can't be free for 2 days and he's right
Mhm.
back for something different. I don't want to be like that guy.
Right.
He's going to spend his whole life in prison.
Mhm.
The next thing that stood out was one day some of us were sitting around a table and talking about what the first thing we were going to do when we got out of jail was. And this one guy, he spoke up and said, the first thing I'm going to do when I get out of here, I'm going to go to Popeye's Chicken and I'm going to get me a 2-piece dark with red beans and rice. And then I'm going to go get me a 8 ball of crack and get blasted. And I thought, this guy has no regret, no will to change at all. I'm not that guy. I do not want to be like that guy and get to that point. And the third thing was most of the inmates were younger to middle-aged men. But there was this one guy that really stuck out because he was in his mid to late 70s. Old man. Everybody called him old man. He had not grown old in prison. He had just recently been arrested for what? For doing drugs. The same thing I had been doing. And so that kind of dispelled this notion I had in my mind that I was holding on to this hope that this drug use was a phase that I would grow out of. And that kind of shattered that idea that I realized I'm not going to grow out of this. So
Mhm.
I put those three situations, it was like I was seeing my life pass before my eyes in phases. If I keep going the way I'm going, I'm going to develop a hard heart that has no remorse like this guy. And I'm going to end up being the repeat offender like this guy. And then I'm going to end up being this old man right here. And so I became terrified and I started thinking, that, this is my only last chance. If I
Mhm.
don't break this cycle right now, this is the trajectory of my life. And so at this point, I was absolutely convinced I was going to change, but at that point, I didn't really know what I could do other than just serve out my time. And then when I got out, I could start trying to do something different.
Mhm.
Well, all that changed one day when this inmate came to me. They called him Brother Roscoe. They called him Brother Roscoe because he had found Jesus. And he was, praise God, hallelujah, amen, to everything. And honestly, it just kind of turned my stomach because I was not ready to jump on the Jesus bandwagon. And it just seemed to be just over the top, everything, Jesus this, Jesus that. And I avoided this guy. I didn't want to have anything to do with him. But one day he kind of caught me, and he asked me if I would join him for chapel services. And I heard myself say, okay, I guess. And I really think the only reason that I went because it was for a change of scenery. To get out of the cell for a little while, they would escort you down the hall to a rec room where they had chapel services. And so I wanted to see what that was like. Get out of the cell for a little bit. But at that meeting, they read some scriptures, and these men, some of these big, tough, prison looking guys, some of them would break down crying, talking about their regrets and their fears, and they would share their thoughts on the verses, and they sang, prayers were offered, and they gave me a Bible. And so I went back to my cell, and I couldn't deny that I felt just a little bit better. And so, I didn't have a lot of distractions in there. There wasn't anything to do. All I could find to do was push-ups and sit-ups and various calisthenic exercises. But now I had a Bible. And so I started reading this Bible. And the more I read it, the more I wanted to read it. And I started praying. I started asking trustees that would bring food to bring me religious material from the prison library. And as soon as they would come the next day, I'd give them that book back, and they'd bring me another one. Some of the inmates, some of us were staying up, and we were having Bible discussions at night. And I started really feeling a lot more hopeful for my future. And then one day my dad came to visit, and it was just like on television. They had the phone, they had the glass. I had to look at him through the glass and pick up the phone to talk to my dad. And I told him, and I can't imagine how bad he felt looking at me. I got in a scuffle. I had stitches in my eye. But I told him, I said, Dad, I've been reading the Bible, and I've decided I want to dedicate the rest of my life to Christ. And I asked him if he would find me a church with a group of people my age, could be like a support group to help keep me on the right path. I did give him some doctrinal restrictions based on, little things I had heard people argue about from the scriptures growing up. And as I read through the Bible, I read from Matthew to Revelation, and then from Genesis all the way to 2 Samuel by the time I got out. I was hardcore reading. And I had determined that some of these things, this is right. And I said, I want you to find me a church that does this and believes this and has a group of young people that can help me. And so I got out of prison. I started attending that church. And I guess the next most important thing was I asked the preacher one day. I went to his office, and I told him about my past. And I said, statistically, people like me don't usually stay clean. Most people use again, and I know that. And so what do you recommend? How do I keep from doing this? And, I've been to preaching school now, and I know that they didn't tell him how to answer this question. And so that's what's even more impressive to me, that he knew, that he gave me such a good answer. But the answer he gave me was the best answer I could have ever heard, and it's carried me to where I am today. He said, just get involved in the services of the church. Try to get out of your comfort zone and do what anything they ask you to do. Be a part of every function, service that's going on. And so that's what I did. I acted like my life depended on it. And I went to every service. I went to every function, every youth meeting, every visitation group, every Bible study, whether it was at the building or someone's home. I was putting in about 5 days a week doing things with the church. And I got to where I was visiting sick people. I was visiting shut-ins, visitors that came to the congregation. I was sitting in on Bible studies that were being done to convert people. And I started leading prayers. I started doing announcements. I just did everything they asked me to do. And so I built myself a support group among these Christians. They said, change playgrounds and playmates. I found some new playmates, and I found a new playground. And these people became my accountability partners. And then eventually that led to me finding a wife in the church one day who has never had a drop of alcohol or done drugs in her life. I have a son now who's 18 that the same can be said about. Both of them are strongly against all that stuff. And so they are kind of my rock. If I ever felt weak, they would help me. And ultimately that that plan that guy gave me eventually brought me to become a preacher. I would have never ever imagined that I would be a preacher, but the course he set me out on, do what they ask you to do, get out of your comfort zone, serve the Lord in every way you can. That's just where it brought me.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of conviction. I felt like I owed the Lord a lot. And so let me summarize, I guess. Now, here's the things that I think were important to my recovery. Several things come to mind. First of all, is I got to the point where the misery outweighed the pleasure. Some people don't get to that point. Some people enjoy using so much they don't want to quit using, like the guy in prison.
Yeah.
But I was not. I got to the point where I hated the life I was living, and I wanted to change. The misery outweighed the pleasure. The second thing was the tough love my dad showed me. You know, a lot of parents become enablers. They just cave every time they ask them for money or whatever. And my dad didn't do that. He showed me tough love. He made me make a choice. And that motivated me to take that very hard step to get professional help. Third, was the things I learned, the information I learned in rehab from the support groups and from the facilitators that were teaching lessons. That really got me thinking in a positive way about change, and it equipped me a little bit with some tools and got me thinking about changing my life. Next was the observations I made in jail, which reminded me of the futility of the path I was on, and I think it humbled me to the point that I was kind of open for new strategies. But that comes to the final and most important thing of all. To me, the most important part of my recovery was that Bible that was in my cell. That Bible was my constant companion. It gave me hope. It gave me a pattern to follow. Those men I was reading about in the Bible, they became my heroes. And they were the heroes that those musicians used to be in my life. And I started praying daily. And somebody told me something one day that I probably don't share enough. And this guy told me in one of these meetings, he said, have you ever got down on the floor and crawled around on your hands and knees looking for crack you might have lost? And of course, anybody who's done crack will answer yes to that. It's just part of it. You want it so bad, you just, when you're starting to run out, you start looking, crawling on your hands and knees, looking through the carpet, thinking you lost something. And he said, are you a praying person? I said, yes. He said, well, try this. Tonight, when you pray, get down on your hands and knees and pray. If you'll get down on your hands and knees for a crack rock, why not get down on your hands and knees for God? And so I started praying on my hands and knees every time in the jail cell. I was on my hands and knees praying. And when I got out of jail, then it was the church. It was the church where I made those Christian friends who, whether they knew it or not, they became my support group and my accountability partners. And it was that good advice I received from the preacher. And so I could not have done it without Jesus Christ. And so that's the best advice that I could give anybody, is to just give your life to him. And if your life is broken, if you think you don't have a life left, what do you have to lose? Just give it to him. To me, it really wasn't that hard of a choice when I got to the point where my life was so broken. Unfortunately, though, I've done prison ministry. I've talked to a lot of people looking for somebody that has got to that point like me. And unfortunately, and surprisingly to me, I don't find near as many people as I would think that have got to the point where they say, I don't have anything else to live for but Christ. But that was my choice. And I want to be respectful to everybody and to choose their own way. Some people may not be believers in God and Christ. And I understand God gave us that choice. If he wanted robots, he would have created robots. He wants us to choose to love him. Yeah. And even if you don't believe in God and Christ, you can still have success. You can still have hope being clean and sober. But I do believe you'll be limiting your potential. It can be done, and it has been done. In fact, I believe I read an article about Robert Downey Jr. that he cleaned his life up and he used yoga, a 12-step program, and yoga and Wing Chun Kung Fu, as things that, and so it can be done. But I would like to point out that why wouldn't you want God if you're a believer, I don't know why you wouldn't want God on your side. If you're not a believer, I still would point this out to you. The reason that 12-step programs have the success they have is because the men who created them were God-fearing men who based them on on biblical principles. And you can look that up and you can confirm that. Support groups all around the world that are enjoying all this success, and they were established on biblical principles, such as Paul wrote to the Galatians, he said, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so
Hmm.
fulfill the law of Christ." And then James said, "Confess your faults one to another." And that's what support groups do. That's what they're based on: burden sharing and confessing our problems, our faults. And then there's biblical principles like 1 Corinthians 15:33, "Be not deceived, evil companionships corrupt good morals." That, to me, that sounds like where the mantra "change playgrounds and playmates" may have come from. And then there's the idea of hitting rock bottom, and you see that in the parable of the prodigal, who,
Hmm.
he went off into that far country, and incidentally, his father didn't follow him off into the far country begging him back. His father let him go, and the world defeated him. And then the Bible says that he was there in the pig pen, thinking about the slop that the pigs were eating was starting to look good to him, and he realized, hey, maybe my way wasn't so good after all. And it says he came to himself. To me, that's hitting rock bottom. I'm winding this up. I
All
know
right.
I'm running
Now, this
long.
is great. You've done such
Okay.
a great job telling your story. I've enjoyed listening to it.
This next part is really personal to me, and I do understand that what works for one person, it's not a one size fits all. It doesn't always work for everyone for various reasons. But I came to a conclusion in my mind that I came to realize that if these support groups and these recovery programs were based on the Bible, why not go to the source? Why not just go to
Mhm.
the source? And I attended a lot of these meetings, and they played a good part of my recovery. In a Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. I went to all those meetings many times, and I won't say anything bad about them. They helped. But I came to a realization. I got to thinking, how tragic would it be after, to spend the rest of my life sober, enjoying sobriety, but still at the end of my life die and go to hell, the very place that kept me from pulling that trigger that night. And I thought, I don't want that to be the end. I don't want that to be my story. And so I decided I want to save my body and my soul. And so if I'm going to go to meetings for the rest of my life, why not just, instead of going to recovery meetings, why not just go to the meetings of the church that they were based on? And then I can save not only my body, but I save my soul as well. And if
Mhm.
I'm going to read a book like the AA book, people read that religiously. If I'm going to read a book every day, why not read the Bible and save my body and my soul? If
Mhm.
I'm going to stand up like I did many times in meetings and say, I'm Bruce Hatcher, I'm
Mhm.
a drug addict, why not just stand up and say, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God and save my body and soul? And finally, if I'm going to go to take 12 steps to sobriety, why not just follow in the steps of Jesus every day and save my body and soul together? And so that was my way of thinking. And that's how the church really became my support group.
Yeah.
And staying busy serving the Lord has kept me clean and sober for 30 years now.
Yeah.
Going on it, man. I think we're maybe 29. I quit counting, honestly. I can't tell you my date of sobriety, but it was about 29 years ago. Some people really focus on the date of sobriety, and I'm not knocking that. But, Paul said, I've learned this to forget the things of the past and press towards the mark. And so I
Right.
honestly don't spend a lot of time looking back. I keep
Hmm.
looking forward. And so
Great.
I hope something I've said has been helpful and will help someone else find hope and recovery.
I am sure that our listeners will gain so much wisdom from listening to your story, and it is inspiring. As you know, I was privileged to get to hear it one other time before our interview, and I was struck by it. And then we were told by a mutual friend that you really should put this out on the podcast. And so I'm just praying that this reaches exactly who needs to hear it and that they'll share it, outward from there. So many things that you said I feel like will resonate with people that are struggling, even if they're not struggling to the depth that you did, but with other things they could be struggling with. A lot of what you said can apply to so many areas of life where we struggle. And I just appreciate you breaking it down like you did. And I love some of the parallels you said there about the idea about changing your playground and your playmates, and of course about bad company corrupts good morals. All of that just is such a beautiful way to connect it back to the true source with the Bible. And I just love that you made that connection for us. And I just think that if anyone is listening, by the way, and they want to reach out to Bruce, his email will be in the show notes. And he has said he would welcome having a conversation with someone that might be going through these struggles and needs to have someone that they could talk to. So I appreciate you making yourself available for that as well.
I
Thank you.
would encourage people to, going to rehab is an important step, and it shouldn't be underestimated. And one of the things that I didn't touch on is some of the drugs that people get addicted to, like heroin, and people underestimate alcohol. Alcohol and heroin are two of the worst in the sense that you can die just from the withdrawals of quitting. If you've been drinking long enough, you try to quit cold turkey and you can die as a result. Same way with heroin. And so, an important part of rehabilitation is they know this and they will put you under medical surveillance and detox your body in a safe environment so you live to recover. My mother died of alcoholism, and she actually, we had a really bad relationship because after I got my life clean, I couldn't really spend much time with her because she was an alcoholic and I couldn't be around that. But we talked a lot, and she ended up saying, I'm going to quit. I'm going to quit drinking. I'm going to quit cold turkey. And I advised her, don't do that. And it killed her. And I knew it was a possibility. I told her, and it did kill her. So I would just remind people that it's serious. Seek professional help.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, as you said, along with seeking that professional help is to get plugged in, with a support group. I believe, as you, a church being the best source of support, especially one that is preaching the word and really encourages you to get involved and to have that relationship with Jesus. So, is there
Right.
any one last thing you would like to leave us with today before we wrap up?
Just always remember there's hope. And, as long as you're breathing and as long as this heart is pumping, there's
Yeah,
hope. And so just don't give up.
that's right. Well, thank you again for being here today and for sharing so transparently a beautiful transformation story and just showing us what all God has done in your life. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie, for having me.